Hey guys, tonight we begin with something soothing. Something gentle, something perfect for drifting off to sleep. Royal treason. So dim the lights, adjust the pillow. Maybe pretend you are not about to hear about some of the most stressful marriages in European history. Because tonight we are floating, very calmly, through the surprisingly repetitive fate of royal women accused of betraying the crown. Which, as it turns out, was often just code for the king is in a mood. And we'll start, softly and without sudden movements, with a woman whose entire life was basically one long political gamble, Anne Boleyn. Now Anne did not begin life expecting to lose her head. Most people don't. She was born into the ambitious but not quite royal Boleyn family around 1501. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a courtier. Her mother, Elizabeth Howard, came from noble stock. It was a family tree that whispered, "We are important," but did not quite shout it. Anne spent her early years abroad, learning French courtly manners. She developed sharp wit, a fashionable wardrobe, and the kind of confidence that made men both intrigued and mildly nervous. Enter Henry VIII, a man who began his reign athletic and charismatic, and ended it shaped like a decorative Ottoman with absolute power. When Henry first noticed Anne, he was already married to Catherine of Aragon. Catherine had been a loyal wife for decades. She had survived miscarriages, political tension, and Henry's wandering eye. But she had not produced a surviving son. And for Henry, that was the problem. Because nothing says stable monarchy like panic over a male heir. Anne, unlike Catherine, did not immediately agree to become Henry's mistress, which, ironically, made her far more interesting to him. She refused. She flirted. She withdrew. She essentially invented the 16th century version of maybe. Henry became obsessed. He wrote her love letters that were surprisingly intense. He declared his marriage invalid. He broke from the authority of the Pope. He launched the English Reformation. Entire monasteries were dissolved, all for a woman who said no. And eventually, in 1533, Anne became queen. Which sounds glamorous. But becoming queen in this situation was like being promoted to captain of a ship that was already on fire. At first, Anne seemed triumphant. She was crowned with ceremony. She gave birth to a daughter. That daughter was Elizabeth, the first future icon, but at the time, deeply disappointing to Henry, because Henry wanted a son. Specifically a breathing, living son who would outlast infancy. Anne suffered miscarriages afterward, including at least one that was rumored to have been a boy. Henry's affection cooled rapidly. He began looking elsewhere, again, because of course he did. By 1536, Anne's position was fragile. Court factions turned against her. The king had noticed another lady-in-waiting, Jane Seymour, and suddenly, whispers began. Whispers of adultery. Now here's where royal treason accusations become flexible. Anne was accused of having affairs with multiple men, including musicians, courtiers, even her own brother, George Boleyn, which, if true, would have been catastrophic. But historians widely agree that the charges were manufactured. The dates didn't align. Some alleged encounters occurred when Anne was visibly pregnant, or in entirely different locations. But truth was not the point. The point was convenience. Anne was arrested in May 1536. She was taken to the Tower of London, the same place where she had once prepared for her coronation. The symmetry is almost poetic, in a bleak way. She maintained her innocence, calmly, intelligently. But the trial was largely ceremonial. The outcome had been decided. She was found guilty of adultery, incest, and high treason. The punishment? Death. Henry, in what was perhaps a small gesture of mercy, or perhaps an aesthetic choice, arranged for a skilled swordsman from France rather than the traditional English axe. Because presentation matters. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed. She reportedly behaved with composure, even grace. She did not publicly accuse the king. She did not rage. She acknowledged him as a good ruler, which is either remarkable diplomacy or survival instinct to the very end. And just like that, a queen vanished. Henry married Jane Seymour 11 days later. Because royal grief moves quickly. So what actually happened to Anne Boleyn? She was politically inconvenient. She failed to produce a son. She had powerful enemies. And she was accused of treason as a legal mechanism to remove her cleanly. No messy divorces. No theological debates. Just a swift declaration that the queen was, apparently, a criminal mastermind who had seduced half the court. It set a precedent. Because once you can accuse a queen of treason, you can do it again. And Henry did. Let's gently drift toward another wife. Another accusation. Another Tower of London staycation. Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard was much younger than Anne, possibly a teenager when she caught Henry's eye, which, at this point in his life, was deeply unsettling. Henry was nearly 50, injured, frequently in pain, moody, but still king. Catherine was lively, flirtatious, and not especially well educated. She grew up in a somewhat chaotic household under the supervision of her step-grandmother, where supervision was loose, and by loose we mean teenage romances happened. Before her marriage to Henry in 1540, Catherine had relationships with two men, Henry Maddox and Francis Derham. These were youthful affairs, reckless, yes, but not unusual for someone her age. The problem? She did not fully disclose them. When Catherine married Henry, she became queen almost overnight. Henry was delighted. He called her his rose without a thorn, which should have worried everyone. Because when Henry idealized a woman, reality tended to disappoint him. Rumors of Catherine's past eventually surfaced. Enemies at court investigated. They found witnesses, letters, confessions, and then came the most dangerous word in Tudor England, pre-contract. If Catherine had been formally betrothed to another man before marrying Henry, her marriage could be invalid, which would mean she had deceived the king. And deception of the king was treason. To make matters worse, evidence emerged that Catherine may have continued a flirtation, possibly even an affair, with Thomas Culpeper during her marriage. That was enough. Catherine was arrested in 1541. She reportedly panicked. At one point trying to run to Henry to plead her case, it did not work. She was confined, investigated, interrogated, eventually convicted of treason. On February 13, 1542, she was executed. She was likely around 19 or 20 years old. Young, frightened, and legally categorized as a traitor to the crown. Henry's pattern was now unmistakable. Royal women accused of sexual misconduct could be reframed as political threats. Their bodies became sites of treason. And here's the sleepy, unsettling truth. Once you are queen, your private life is state property. If it embarrasses the king, it becomes a crime. Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard were not the only royal women to face treason charges, but they became cautionary tales, symbols of how fragile queenship could be when tied to a monarch's ego. And we are just getting started. Because England was not unique. Let's float very slowly across the channel to Scotland, to another queen, one who ruled in her own right. Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary's story is longer, messier, and involves more letters. Imagine, if you will, being crowned queen before you can walk. Not metaphorically, literally. That was the situation for Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary became Queen of Scotland when she was 6 days old. 6 days old. Most babies at that age are focused on blinking and basic breathing. Mary was technically running a kingdom. Of course, she wasn't actually ruling. Regents handled that. But from the very beginning, her life was not her own. She was a political chess piece wrapped in velvet. To keep her safe from English interference, she was sent to France as a child. There she grew up at the glittering court of the Valois dynasty. She married the future king, Francis II of France. She became Queen of France at 16, which sounds glamorous. It lasted 1 year. Francis died in 1560. Suddenly Mary was a teenage widow. and no longer politically essential in France. So back to Scotland she went. Now here's where things start to unravel in that slow, almost predictable way history loves. Scotland had changed while she was away. The Protestant Reformation had taken hold. The country was religiously divided. And Mary, a Catholic queen raised in France, returned to a kingdom that was complicated. She tried to rule diplomatically. She wasn't incompetent. She was intelligent, educated, multilingual, but she had one enormous problem: her claim to the English throne. Mary was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII through his daughter Margaret Tudor, which meant that, in the eyes of many Catholics, she had a stronger claim to England than Elizabeth I, who, awkwardly, happened to already be ruling it. Elizabeth was Protestant, unmarried, and cautious. Mary was Catholic, married, dramatic, and a magnet for trouble. At first, their relationship was distant, but not openly hostile. Elizabeth kept an eye on her cousin, which is royal code for politely terrified. Then Mary made a series of romantic decisions that can only be described as historically unfortunate. Her second husband was Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. He was handsome, arrogant, and also had a claim to the English throne. Because nothing says stability like marrying your rival claimant, the marriage deteriorated quickly. Darnley was jealous, immature, politically reckless. He helped orchestrate the brutal murder of Mary's secretary, David Rizzio, right in front of her, while she was pregnant. Not exactly couple goals. Their son, the future James VI, was born in 1566. Then, in 1567, Darnley died, under suspicious circumstances. He was staying at a house in Edinburgh called Kirk O'Field. An explosion destroyed the building. His body was found outside, strangled. Now, here's the problem. Suspicion fell on James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, a powerful Scottish noble. And within months, Mary married him, which did not look good. To many Scottish nobles, this appeared incriminating. Whether Mary had actually conspired in Darnley's murder remains debated, but the optics were catastrophic. She was accused of complicity, of adultery, of conspiracy, essentially of treason against her own husband, and by extension, her realm. The Scottish lords rebelled. Mary was imprisoned in Lochleven Castle. She was forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son. Notice the pattern? When a royal woman's romantic life created instability, the solution was not counseling. It was confinement. Mary eventually escaped and attempted to regain her throne. She failed. So she made what would become the most consequential decision of her life. She fled to England, to Elizabeth. Now pause here, because this is where things become quietly tragic in a very slow burn way. Mary believed Elizabeth, as a fellow queen, would help her, perhaps restore her to power. Elizabeth instead placed her under house arrest. For 19 years, Mary lived as a captive guest, moved between castles, watched constantly. Her existence became a focal point for Catholic plots against Elizabeth. Whether she actively encouraged them or simply existed as a symbol is still debated. But here's the issue. If you are the alternative queen, every conspiracy automatically includes you. Eventually, in 1586, the Babington Plot emerged. A plan to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the English throne. Letters were intercepted. Mary's coded correspondence was deciphered. She appeared to approve the plan. That was enough. She was tried for treason against England, which is legally fascinating, because she was not technically an English subject. She was a foreign queen. But politics tends to stretch legal definitions. Mary defended herself eloquently. She argued she had not been allowed legal counsel, that she had been entrapped, that she was a sovereign queen. It did not matter. She was convicted. Elizabeth hesitated. For months. Executing a fellow anointed monarch was unprecedented, dangerous, symbolic. But eventually, in February 1587, the warrant was signed. Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed at Fotheringhay Castle. Accounts describe her dressed in black, then revealing crimson beneath, the color of martyrdom. She reportedly maintained dignity, composure, even humor. It took more than one blow to complete the execution. We will not dwell on that. This is a sleepy channel. But consider the quiet irony. Mary was accused of treason in a country she fled to for safety. Her lineage made her dangerous. Her existence made her a threat. Unlike Anne Boleyn or Catherine Howard, Mary was not executed because a husband was bored. She was executed because she represented a living alternative. And in monarchies, alternatives are treasonous by default. Elizabeth herself understood this deeply, which may explain why she never married, never produced a direct heir. She had seen what proximity to power did to women. Royal women accused of treason often fell into one of three categories. They failed to produce stability, they embarrassed the crown, or they simply existed at the wrong time. Anne failed to produce a son. Catherine had a romantic past. Mary had a blood claim. And each, in her own way, was transformed from queen to criminal. Now let's drift slightly east, to France, to a queen who was accused not just of treason, but of almost every vice imaginable. Because if you think English courts were dramatic, wait until we softly approach the French Revolution. We're going to meet a woman whose name became shorthand for extravagance. Marie Antoinette, and her story is less about romantic scandal, and more about public fury. So settle in. Let's float gently into France. Picture powdered wigs, silk gowns, excessive pastries, a court so glittering it practically glows in candlelight. And in the center of it all, a teenage Austrian archduchess shipped across Europe to cement an alliance. Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette was born in 1755, the daughter of Maria Theresa, Austria's formidable ruler. Her childhood was comfortable, musical, and not particularly rigorous academically. She liked dancing. She liked fashion. She did not particularly like studying statcraft, which, unfortunately, would become relevant. At 14, she was married off to the future Louis XVI. The marriage was meant to strengthen ties between Austria and France. Romantic compatibility was not a primary concern. The wedding was elaborate, the expectations were immense, and the young couple did not consummate the marriage for several years. This became public knowledge, because the French court treated royal intimacy like national news. Whispers spread. Pamphlets circulated. Marie Antoinette was mocked for perceived frigidity. Louis was teased for awkwardness. Nothing says relaxing monarchy like your bedroom life being a topic of political discussion. Eventually, the marriage was consummated. Children were born. But by then, Marie Antoinette's reputation had already begun to wobble. She was foreign, Austrian, and at a time when France's finances were deteriorating, foreign was not a helpful identity. The French monarchy was drowning in debt. Years of war, including support for the American Revolution, had drained the treasury. The tax system was inefficient. The nobility were largely exempt. Bread prices rose, harvests failed. And meanwhile, the Queen enjoyed fashion. Now here's where history becomes unfair in a very quiet, very human way. Marie Antoinette did spend extravagantly. She loved gowns, jewels, elaborate hairstyles. She renovated a small retreat at Versailles called the Petit Trianon. She even built a mock rustic village where she could pretend to be a milkmaid in designer muslin, which, to starving peasants, did not read as charming whimsy. It read as tone-deaf fantasy. Did she say, "Let them eat cake"? Almost certainly not. There is no solid evidence she ever uttered those words. The phrase appeared in print years earlier and was likely attached to her later because it fit the narrative. But facts matter less than symbolism. And Marie Antoinette became a symbol. Pamphlets accused her of affairs, of manipulating the king, of bankrupting the nation, of incest. of lesbian relationships, of treasonous correspondence with Austria. When public frustration needs a face, it often chooses the most visible one. In 1789, the French Revolution began. The Bastille fell. Crowds marched to Versailles. The royal family was forced to relocate to Paris under guard. And here's where treason enters softly, almost inevitably. The king and queen attempted to flee France in 1791, the flight to Varennes. They were recognized, arrested, returned to Paris. That failed escape attempt transformed suspicion into certainty. They were no longer merely out-of-touch monarchs. They were perceived traitors. France abolished the monarchy in 1792. Louis XVI was tried for treason, convicted, executed. In January 1793, Marie Antoinette's turn came later that year. Her trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal was swift. The charges were extensive: conspiring with foreign powers, draining the treasury, undermining the state. One particularly grotesque accusation claimed she had abused her own son. Even hardened observers reportedly felt that charge crossed a line. She defended herself calmly. When accused of harming her child, she turned to the women in the courtroom and said she appealed to all mothers present. It was a rare moment of emotional clarity in a proceeding otherwise thick with hostility. But the verdict was predetermined. On October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette was executed by guillotine. Unlike Anne Boleyn, there was no discreet swordsman. Unlike Mary, Queen of Scots, there was no lengthy hesitation. This was revolutionary justice, public, efficient, final. So what actually happened to Marie Antoinette? She became the embodiment of systemic failure. France's financial collapse was not solely her fault. Structural inequality, war debt, agricultural crisis, political rigidity, these were complex forces. But complexity does not satisfy anger. A queen in silk is easier to blame than a broken tax code. And so she was tried for treason not simply because of what she did, but because of what she represented. Royal women accused of treason often become mirrors. They reflect the anxieties of their era. Anne Boleyn reflected dynastic insecurity. Mary, Queen of Scots, reflected religious division and succession panic. Marie Antoinette reflected economic collapse and revolutionary rage. Let's gently drift to another setting, another empire. Another woman whose proximity to power became dangerous. This time we'll move to Russia. Snow, palaces, intrigue that moves a little more quietly, but just as decisively. We're going to meet Alexandra Fyodorovna. She was not accused of romantic scandal in the way Anne or Catherine were. Nor was she a foreign symbol of decadence in quite the same way as Marie Antoinette. Instead, she was accused of something more subtle: influence. And during wartime, influence can look suspiciously like treason. So settle in. Let's move slowly now. Picture Russia in winter. Endless snow. A palace glowing softly against the cold. Candles flickering in tall windows. And inside, a woman who never quite felt at home. Alexandra Fyodorovna was born Princess Alex of Hesse in 1872. German, reserved, intensely private. She grew up in a small but respectable German duchy, the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, which meant she inherited not only royal connections, but also a gene that would quietly haunt her future children. But we'll get to that. She married Nicholas II in 1894. It was a love match, which already made it suspicious in dynastic terms. Love marriages in royal families often come with consequences, because love rarely considers geopolitics. When Alexandra arrived in Russia, she converted to Orthodoxy. She tried to fit in. She learned the language. But she never quite connected with the Russian public. She was shy, awkward in crowds, not particularly gifted at smiling for peasants. And peasants, as it turns out, appreciate smiling. Then came the succession problem. Alexandra gave birth to 4 daughters in a row: Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia. Lovely, healthy girls. But Russia needed a son, an heir. The pressure was immense. Alexandra felt it deeply. She believed producing a male heir was her sacred duty. When her son Alexei was finally born in 1904, there was relief, celebration, cannon fire, and then the quiet horror. Alexei had hemophilia, a genetic bleeding disorder inherited through Alexandra's side of the family, a legacy from Queen Victoria's bloodline that had already spread through several European royal houses. In practical terms, this meant that a small bruise could become life-threatening. A fall could trigger internal bleeding. The heir to the Russian throne was physically fragile in a way that terrified his mother. Alexandra became protective, withdrawn, increasingly anxious. Enter a mystic. Grigory Rasputin was a Siberian peasant with hypnotic eyes and questionable hygiene. He appeared at court claiming spiritual gifts. And somehow, through prayer, suggestion, or perhaps simply calming the boy's caretakers, he seemed able to ease Alexei's symptoms during bleeding episodes. For Alexandra, this was enough. She trusted him completely. The Russian aristocracy did not. Rumors spread that Rasputin controlled the empress, that he influenced political decisions, that he was her lover, that he was secretly running the empire in between mystical trances and heavy drinking. Most of these rumors were exaggerated or entirely fabricated. But perception matters more than truth during unstable times. Now add one more ingredient. World War I. When war broke out in 1914, Russia found itself fighting Germany. And Alexandra, inconveniently, was German by birth. Her loyalty was questioned immediately. Whispers began. Was she secretly corresponding with the Kaiser? Was she undermining military strategy? There is no solid evidence she committed treason. None. But she was foreign, isolated, deeply unpopular, and heavily influenced by a mystic everyone distrusted, which, politically speaking, is not ideal. Nicholas II made a catastrophic decision in 1915. He left the capital to personally command the Russian army at the front. This left Alexandra in charge of domestic affairs. She was not trained for this. Ministers were appointed and dismissed rapidly. Rasputin's recommendations were often followed. The government appeared unstable. Food shortages worsened. Military losses mounted. To ordinary Russians, it looked like chaos directed by a German empress and her strange holy man. Rasputin was murdered in 1916 by nobles who believed they were saving Russia. They believed removing him would restore faith in the monarchy. It did not. By 1917, revolution was brewing. Bread riots, worker strikes, soldiers refusing orders. Nicholas abdicated in March 1917. And here's the subtle but important point. Alexandra was never formally tried for treason in the way Marie Antoinette was. There was no grand tribunal, no theatrical courtroom. But she was widely believed to be a traitor. And in revolutionary climates, belief can be fatal. The royal family was placed under house arrest, moved from palace to provincial captivity, their titles stripped, their authority dissolved. In July 1918, the family was executed by Bolshevik forces in Yekaterinburg. No trial, no formal conviction, just elimination. So what actually happened to Alexandra Fyodorovna? She became the embodiment of everything Russians resented in 1917: autocracy, foreign influence, mystical superstition, military failure. Her German origins during wartime made her suspect. Her reliance on Rasputin made her ridiculous in the eyes of the elite. Her devotion to her son made her appear irrational in politics. She was not publicly condemned in a courtroom, but she was condemned in public opinion long before the revolutionaries arrived. And once again, we see the pattern. Royal women accused of treason often occupy symbolic roles larger than their actions. Anne Boleyn was the dangerous seductress. Mary, Queen of Scots, was the Catholic alternative. Marie Antoinette was the extravagant foreigner. Alexandra was the German mystic's puppet. Reality was always more nuanced, but nuance is exhausting, and revolutions prefer simplicity. Let's gently drift now to yet another empire. A warmer climate this time. Fewer snowdrifts. More marble. We'll travel to Byzantium, where palace intrigue was practically a national hobby, and accusations of treason could bloom over theological disagreements or whispered suspicions. There, we'll meet a woman who rose from unlikely beginnings to extraordinary power. Empress Theodora. Her story is older, stranger, and surprisingly modern in its political calculations. So relax. Let's drift back, further back, to Constantinople. To domes and incense and political arguments that lasted longer than most marriages. We're in the 6th century now. The Byzantine Empire, which was essentially the Eastern Roman Empire continuing on, looking at Western Europe like, you're doing what with your plumbing? And at the center of this particular storm is a woman who began life in a way that would make later royal biographers deeply uncomfortable. Empress Theodora. Theodora was not born into nobility. She was likely the daughter of a bearkeeper, yes, an actual bearkeeper for the Hippodrome factions in Constantinople. The blues and the greens were not just sports fans. They were political machines with color-coded enthusiasm. As a young woman, Theodora worked as an actress, which, in Byzantine society, was roughly equivalent to being socially radioactive. Actresses were associated with scandal, performance, moral flexibility. Later historians, particularly Procopius, would describe her early life in ways that are colorful. His secret history portrays her as wildly promiscuous and manipulative. Modern historians take this with a grain of salt. Procopius had opinions, strong ones, possibly grudges. But here's what we do know. Theodora met Justinian I before he became emperor, and he fell for her, completely, which was awkward, because Roman law prohibited senators from marrying actresses, and Justinian, as heir apparent, was very much in that category. So the law was changed, because why not adjust the legal code when you're about to control the empire? They married. In 527, Justinian became emperor, and Theodora became empress. Now, if you're expecting a gentle decorative consort who quietly arranges flowers and waves from balconies, that was not Theodora. She was politically engaged, sharp, assertive. She advised Justinian directly. She influenced policy. She supported legislation expanding women's rights in areas like divorce and property ownership, which, naturally, did not endear her to everyone. And here's where accusations of treason enter, but in a slightly different form. In 532, Constantinople exploded. The Nika riots began as factional violence between the Blues and Greens in the Hippodrome, but they escalated rapidly into full-scale rebellion against Justinian. Crowds chanted Nika, meaning victory. They burned buildings. They declared a new emperor. Justinian panicked. There were ships waiting. He considered fleeing the city. And this is where Theodora delivered one of the most famous speeches in imperial history. According to Procopius, she told Justinian that royal purple makes a fine burial shroud. In other words, better to die as empress than live in exile. Now whether she said those exact words is debated, but the essence is widely accepted. She refused to run. Her firmness steadied Justinian. He stayed. His generals, including Belisarius, suppressed the riot. Brutally, tens of thousands died in the Hippodrome. So how does this connect to treason? Well, in the aftermath, Theodora played a role in purging perceived enemies. Senators suspected of supporting the revolt were executed or exiled. Power was consolidated. And whispers began. Some accused her of ruthlessness, of manipulating Justinian, of orchestrating the crackdown to eliminate rivals. In Procopius' secret history, she is portrayed almost as a tyrant in silk. Was she formally tried for treason? No, but she was accused, informally and persistently, of wielding power in ways that unsettled male elites. She was portrayed as dangerous, immoral, corrupting. And here we see something slightly different from earlier stories. Anne Boleyn was executed because she was inconvenient. Mary, Queen of Scots, because she was a rival. Marie Antoinette, because she was symbolic. Alexandra, because she was distrusted. Theodora, she survived. She was accused in whispers, smeared in texts, vilified by historians. But she remained empress until her death in 548, which is quietly remarkable. Sometimes, royal women accused of treason endure not because the accusations lack force, but because they have enough power to outlast them. Theodora had Justinian's unwavering loyalty. That was her shield. Without it, her early life alone might have been weaponized against her. And this brings us to a subtle truth. Treason is often less about law and more about narrative. If a royal woman lacks protection, accusations become verdicts. If she retains influence, accusations become gossip. Let's gently move forward again, back to England. Because England, as we've noticed, had a particular fondness for calling queens traitors when convenient. But this time, we're not going to the Tudor court. We're heading to the 17th century. To civil war. To Parliament versus Crown. To a queen accused not merely of personal misconduct, but of actively undermining her adopted nation. We're going to meet Henrietta Maria. She was French, Catholic, and married to a king who believed very strongly in divine right, which during a parliamentary uprising is not exactly calming. So settle in. Let's stay in England. The century has shifted. The ruffs are a little smaller, the wigs are getting ambitious, and Parliament has decided it would quite like a larger say in how the kingdom is run. Enter Henrietta Maria. She was born a French princess in 1609, the daughter of Henry IV of France and Marie de Medici, which meant she grew up surrounded by Catholic court culture, political intrigue, and the assumption that monarchy was, frankly, non-negotiable. In 1625, she married Charles I of England. This was not a love match at first. Charles barely spoke French. Henrietta Maria barely spoke English. Their early interactions were chilly. There were arguments, cultural misunderstandings. She insisted on maintaining her Catholic household. English Protestants were not thrilled. But over time, they developed genuine affection. And here is where things become complicated in that soft, inevitable way history prefers. Charles believed in the divine right of kings, meaning he felt accountable primarily to God. Parliament, meanwhile, believed in things like taxation oversight and constitutional limits. These views did not align. Tensions escalated through the 1630s. Charles ruled without Parliament for 11 years. He imposed unpopular taxes. Religious reforms sparked outrage. The atmosphere thickened. And Henrietta Maria, she did not sit quietly. She advised Charles. She supported his policies. She corresponded with European Catholic powers. She sought financial and military assistance for the crown. To royalists, she was loyal and proactive. To parliamentarians, she was a foreign Catholic meddling in English governance. When the English Civil War broke out in 1642, suspicion toward her intensified. Pamphlets portrayed her as manipulative, as the true architect behind Charles' tyranny, as someone pulling invisible strings. There were accusations, not always formal charges, but persistent public claims that she was encouraging Catholic influence and even conspiring with foreign armies against England, which, from Parliament's perspective, looked very much like treason. She traveled to the Netherlands to secure arms and funds for Charles' cause. That fact alone made her an easy target for propaganda. Here was a queen raising money abroad to fund a war against Parliament. In revolutionary language, that's not loyalty. That's betrayal. Now, she was never captured and tried like Marie Antoinette. She remained in exile in France for much of the war. But Parliament formally impeached her in 1643 for high treason. Let that sink in. A queen consort, impeached. The charges centered on her efforts to gather support for the king, which, in her mind, was her duty. In Parliament's framing, it was aiding enemies of the state. Of course, from her perspective, Parliament itself was the enemy. Treason, once again, becomes a matter of angle. Charles I ultimately lost the war. He was tried and executed in 1649, a seismic moment in European history. An anointed king publicly beheaded by his own subjects. Henrietta Maria was in France when she learned of his death. She would never return to England as queen. So what actually happened to her? She was branded a traitor by those who opposed her husband. Not because she plotted against him, not because of romantic scandal, but because she actively supported his absolute rule during a constitutional crisis. She was politically engaged. And in times of civil war, politically engaged queens become liabilities. Now let's gently drift forward again. Because accusations of treason against royal women did not vanish with the Stuarts. They simply evolved. Sometimes the accusations were explicit and lethal. Sometimes they were reputational, slow erosions of credibility. And occasionally, they were strategic tools used by the women themselves. Let's move to a final example, one that feels, at first glance, less dramatic, but is quietly revealing. We'll travel to the Ottoman Empire, to a period historians sometimes call the Sultanate of Women. And there, we'll meet Kasim Sultan. Her story is not about being accused of treason. It is about surviving in a system where treason was always an option. So settle in. Let's ease into the Ottoman court. No powdered wigs here. No parliamentary debates. Instead, think tiled walls, courtyards, layers of silk, and a political structure where the most powerful women did not technically rule, but absolutely influenced who did. We are entering what historians often call the Sultanate of Women, a period in the 16th and 17th centuries when royal mothers, valid sultans, wielded extraordinary power behind palace screens. And at the center of it all stands Kasim Sultan. She was likely born Anastasia on a Greek island around 1589. As a young girl, she was taken to the Ottoman court, converted to Islam, renamed, educated within the imperial harem. Now the word harem often triggers dramatic assumptions, but in practical terms, it was a political institution, highly structured, strategically organized, and filled with women who understood power better than most European diplomats. Kasim rose steadily. She became a favored consort of Sultan Ahmed I. She bore him multiple children, including future sultans. And this is where her story becomes quietly impressive. When Ahmed died in 1617, the Ottoman system did not automatically favor father-to-son succession. Instead, brothers often inherited the throne, which usually meant imprisoned princes, complicated family trees, and a persistent sense that everyone was slightly nervous. Kasim navigated this chaos with remarkable skill. Her son Murad IV eventually became sultan, but he was a child at the time, which made Kasim valid sultan, queen mother, regent in all but name. And unlike many royal women we've discussed, Kasim was not accused of treason in the sense of scandal or adultery. She was accused repeatedly of something far more threatening: control. She influenced appointments. She managed alliances. She oversaw court finances. She cultivated loyalty among janissaries and officials. She understood that survival required flexibility. And in the Ottoman court, failure could be fatal. Murad IV grew up and eventually ruled independently. After his death, Kasim's younger son Ibrahim became sultan. Ibrahim was unstable. His reign was erratic. He developed extravagant obsessions, at one point reportedly demanding women of a particular physical type be gathered for his harem. The empire grew restless. In 1648, Ibrahim was deposed, executed, and once again, Kasim adapted. Her grandson Mehmed IV, still a child, ascended the throne, which meant Kasim resumed regency, twice regent, twice navigating a male-dominated court while technically not ruling at all. Now here's where treason enters softly. Rival factions emerged around another powerful woman in the palace, Turhan Sultan, mother of the young Mehmed IV. Tensions simmered between grandmother and mother. Both sought influence over the child sultan. Rumors spread that Kaiksem intended to replace Mehmed with another grandson more pliable to her authority. Whether true or exaggerated, it created a dangerous narrative. And in imperial courts, narrative is everything. In 1651, Kaiksem Sultan was assassinated in the palace, likely with Turhan Sultan's support. The official charge was not formalized in a European courtroom sense, but the implication was clear. She had overreached. She had allegedly plotted to manipulate succession. In other words, treason. But notice the distinction. Unlike Anne Boleyn or Marie Antoinette, Kaiksem was not punished for scandal or foreignness. She was eliminated because she was politically formidable. And this brings us gently to a broader reflection. Royal women accused of treason fall into patterns. But the patterns shift depending on culture. In Tudor England, sexual conduct could become treason. In revolutionary France, extravagance could become treason. In Russia, foreign birth and mysticism could become treason. In the Ottoman Empire, strategic influence could quietly become treason, especially when it threatened another power center. Now let's float toward our final stretch. Because by now, a theme has emerged as consistently as candlelight in palace corridors. Royal women were rarely accused of treason for mundane reasons. They were accused when they disrupted stability, when they symbolized division, when they embarrassed authority, or when they simply survived too well. And sometimes, the accusation itself was a political tool. A clean way to remove a queen without admitting weakness. A dramatic flourish that reframed personal dissatisfaction as national betrayal. Anne Boleyn's failure to produce a son became treason. Catherine Howard's youthful indiscretions became treason. Mary, Queen of Scots lineage, became treason. Marie Antoinette's visibility became treason. Alexandra's foreignness became treason. Henrietta Maria's loyalty to her husband became treason. Kaiksem's competence became treason. And here is the quiet, slightly uncomfortable truth. Treason for royal women was often elastic, flexible, convenient, because monarchy depends on perception. And when perception falters, someone must absorb the blame. Often, that someone wore a crown and silk and an expression carefully trained not to show fear. If there is something almost sleepy about all this repetition, it's because history has rhythms, patterns, a steady hum beneath the drama. Royal women lived in proximity to absolute power, and proximity is dangerous. If they were passive, they were irrelevant. If they were active, they were threatening. If they were foreign, they were suspect. If they were fertile, they were valuable until they weren't. And once labeled traitor, redemption was rare. Some were executed. Some were exiled. Some were quietly strangled behind palace curtains. And a few, like Theodora or Kaiksem for a time, managed to outmaneuver the accusation, at least until they couldn't. So what actually happened to royal women accused of treason? They became cautionary tales, political scapegoats, symbols of instability, or, occasionally, architects of their own survival. And as you let this drift settle in, consider how fragile power can be when it rests on public approval and private loyalty at the same time. Crowns look solid in portraits. In reality, they balance on whispers. And whispers, as we've seen, can be sharpened into accusations, accusations into trials, and trials into endings. But for tonight, we'll let the candlelight dim before the verdict falls again. Let's take one more slow, meandering stroll through royal scandal. This time, we're in early 19th century Britain. The wigs are slightly less powdered, the waistlines are rising, and newspapers are discovering that royal drama sells very well. Which brings us to Caroline of Brunswick. Now technically, Caroline was not executed. She was not even convicted. But she was accused of behavior so scandalous that Parliament essentially put the Queen on trial in front of the entire nation. Which, for a monarchy, is not ideal branding. Caroline married George IV in 1795, back when he was still Prince of Wales. This marriage was not based on affection. It was based on debt. George had accumulated impressive financial obligations. Parliament agreed to help if he married and produced an heir. Caroline, a German princess with limited romantic illusions, was selected. Their first meeting reportedly went poorly. George found her unrefined. Caroline found him intoxicated. They married anyway. They produced one child, Princess Charlotte, and almost immediately separated. George resumed his extravagant lifestyle. Caroline developed a reputation for unconventional behavior. She traveled widely across Europe, surrounded herself with companions of various backgrounds, adopted a more relaxed approach to royal decorum than British society preferred. Rumors spread. Whispers of affairs, particularly with an Italian man named Bartolomeo Pergami. Now here's where treason becomes more legalistic. Under British law at the time, adultery committed by a queen consort could technically be considered high treason, because it risked the legitimacy of the royal bloodline. Notice the recurring theme? Female sexuality equals national stability. George, who had no shortage of mistresses, found Caroline's alleged conduct intolerable. When he became king in 1820, he sought to dissolve the marriage formally. But divorce required proof, and proof required spectacle. So the government introduced the Pains and Penalties Bill in Parliament. This bill aimed to strip Caroline of her title and dissolve the marriage on grounds of adultery, which led to something extraordinary. The Queen was effectively put on public trial. Witnesses were called. Servants testified. Allegations were aired in excruciating detail. The press reported every moment. Crowds gathered outside Parliament, chanting in her support. Because here's the twist. The public largely sided with Caroline. George IV was unpopular, seen as indulgent, self-serving, and extravagantly detached. Caroline, despite her eccentricities, appeared mistreated. The trial dragged on. The evidence, while suggestive, was not airtight. Public sympathy grew. Eventually, the government withdrew the bill. Caroline technically won, but she was never crowned queen. When George's coronation took place in 1821, she was barred from attending. She reportedly tried to Westminster Abbey and was turned away at the door. Imagine being the queen and denied entry to your own coronation. She died shortly afterward in 1821, under somewhat sudden circumstances, officially from illness, though speculation lingered. So what actually happened to Caroline of Brunswick? She was accused of conduct that, had it been legally confirmed, might have amounted to true treason. But unlike Anne Boleyn, she had public opinion on her side. And public opinion, in constitutional monarchies, is a powerful shield. Her case shows a shift. By the 19th century, executing queens for treason was no longer politically viable in Britain. Instead, reputations were attacked, titles threatened, trials staged in legislative chambers rather than dungeons. The mechanism softened. The impulse remained. Now, as we gently bring all these stories together, notice the long arc. In medieval and early modern periods, accusations of treason against royal women often ended in execution. By the Revolutionary era, trials became public spectacles. By the Constitutional Age, political theater replaced the scaffold. But the underlying anxiety persisted. Royal women occupy a paradoxical position. They are symbols of continuity, mothers of heirs, embodiments of national identity. And yet, they are rarely sovereign in their own right. Their power is derivative, their influence scrutinized, their loyalties questioned if foreign-born, their morality treated as a matter of state security. And when crises arise, it is astonishingly convenient to frame instability as feminine betrayal. Sometimes the accusation is cynical. Sometimes it is genuinely believed. Often, it is both. If there is something quietly repetitive about all of this, it's because monarchy itself is repetitive. Succession anxiety, factional rivalry, public dissatisfaction, and somewhere in the middle, a queen navigating expectations so narrow that any deviation risks disaster. What actually happened to royal women accused of treason? Some lost their heads. Some lost their thrones. Some lost their reputations. A rare few lost nothing at all, because they understood the rules better than their accusers. And perhaps the most soothing, slightly ironic conclusion is this: treason, in royal contexts, has rarely been about espionage or battlefield betrayal. It has more often been about control over lineage, control over narrative, control over who gets to define loyalty. And when a royal woman stepped even slightly outside the invisible boundaries drawn for her, the word treason waited patiently in the wings. Let's slow this down even more, because by now, you might be noticing something gently repetitive. Not every royal woman accused of treason lost her head. Sometimes the punishment was quieter, softer, more administrative, and in its own way, colder. Execution is dramatic. Exile is tidy, but erasure is efficient. So let's drift to a queen who was never formally executed, never dragged to a scaffold, never even convicted in a theatrical trial, and yet, politically speaking, she was removed just the same. We return briefly to Tudor England, because Tudor England simply refuses to relax. After Henry VIII's dramatic marital reshuffling, we arrive at his daughter, not Elizabeth, but her older half-sister, Mary I of England. Now Mary herself accused many people of treason. She is often remembered for that. But what's interesting for us is what happened when her own authority was challenged by another woman. That woman was Lady Jane Grey. Jane was 17, bookish, devout, probably more interested in theology than power. She was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII, which made her a potential claimant to the throne. When Mary's half-brother Edward VI lay dying in 1553, Protestant advisors feared Mary would reverse the Reformation. So they arranged for Jane to be named successor instead. Jane reportedly did not leap at the opportunity. She had to be persuaded, but she was declared queen. For 9 days, Mary gathered support quickly. Public sympathy leaned toward her as Henry VIII's legitimate daughter. Jane's support collapsed. Mary entered London triumphantly. Jane was imprisoned in the Tower. Now here's the gentle, uncomfortable detail. Jane herself had not plotted extensively. She was a teenager placed in an impossible situation. But she had accepted the crown. And accepting the crown made her, legally speaking, a traitor against the rightful monarch. She was tried, convicted of high treason. Mary initially hesitated to execute her. Jane was young, possibly manipulated. But political rebellions erupted in Jane's name. Protestant uprisings threatened Mary's stability. So in 1554, Jane was executed. Technically, she had committed treason by claiming the throne. Realistically, she had been used. And here again, we see how elastic the concept becomes. Sometimes treason is ambition. Sometimes it's proximity. Sometimes it's simply being the alternative. Let's drift slightly forward again. Because sometimes royal women weren't accused of treason directly. Instead, they were accused of influencing treasonous men, which, historically, is a very convenient category. Consider Isabella of France. She married Edward II of England in the early 14th century. Edward was complicated. He favored certain male courtiers intensely, particularly Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despencer. This caused enormous tension among the nobility. Isabella initially tried to navigate the court diplomatically, but over time she became politically sidelined, financially restricted, publicly humiliated. Eventually, she left England and formed an alliance with the exiled noble Roger Mortimer. And then she invaded. Yes, invaded. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed in England with a small force. Support swelled rapidly. Edward II was deposed. Later, He died under suspicious circumstances in captivity. Isabella ruled as regent for her young son, Edward III of England. Now pause. From one perspective, Isabella committed outright treason. She invaded her own husband's kingdom, deposed him, installed her son. From another perspective, she corrected misrule. History can be remarkably accommodating when outcomes stabilize. For several years, Isabella and Mortimer governed. But Mortimer's power grew unpopular. In 1330, young Edward III staged a coup. Mortimer was arrested and executed for treason. And Isabella? She was not executed. She was quietly removed from power, placed under a form of honorable house arrest, later allowed a comfortable retirement. She had participated in rebellion. She had overthrown a king, yet she survived. Why? Because she was the king's mother. Because executing her would destabilize legitimacy. Because sometimes the crown needs to forget rather than punish. And this brings us to an interesting evolution. In earlier centuries, royal women accused of treason could be physically eliminated. But as monarchies matured, particularly in Europe, the response shifted. Instead of execution, they were confined. They were divorced. They were stripped of titles. They were isolated in remote castles. Reputation became the battlefield. Let's briefly revisit the idea of accusation itself. Treason requires definition. Against whom? Against the king? Against the state? Against the nation? As monarchies transitioned into constitutional systems, treason shifted from personal betrayal of a ruler to legal betrayal of a political entity. And royal women, once accused for personal disobedience or marital scandal, increasingly faced reputational wars instead of death sentences. But the underlying tension remained. Royal women sit at the intersection of private life and public consequence. A marriage is never just a marriage. A pregnancy is never just a pregnancy. A friendship can be framed as conspiracy. A letter can become evidence. A foreign accent can become suspicion. And perhaps most fascinating of all is this. Very few royal women accused of treason were guilty in the modern criminal sense. They were guilty of destabilizing expectations, of embodying change, of existing inconveniently. Even Marie Antoinette's treason was more symbolic than strategic. Even Anne Boleyn's charges were legally dubious. Even Alexandra Feodorovna's alleged betrayal lacked proof. The accusation itself often served a purpose greater than any verdict. It unified opposition. It redirected blame. It simplified complex political failures into a single digestible narrative. The Queen betrayed us. And narratives are soothing, especially in times of chaos, because it's easier to imagine a single villain than systemic instability. So what actually happened to royal women accused of treason? They became cautionary boundaries, warnings, living examples of how close one could stand to power before falling through it. Some lost their lives. Some lost their freedom. Some lost their names to history. And some, like Isabella of France, quietly outlived the storm they helped create. If there's a final, gentle rhythm here, it's this. Monarchies are fragile ecosystems. They depend on loyalty, bloodlines, perception, and carefully maintained illusions. When something cracks, a war lost, a famine endured, a religious divide sharpened, the temptation to identify a human cause is strong. Royal women, visible yet politically constrained, make convenient focal points. They are close enough to power to be blamed, yet rarely powerful enough to fully defend themselves. And as the centuries pass, the methods change. Axes become trials. Trials become newspaper campaigns. Campaigns become social media debates. But the instinct to accuse remains quietly familiar. So as you settle into sleep, imagine the echo of distant palace corridors once more. And so, we arrive at the final stretch of our very long, very steamy journey. By now, you can practically smell the bathhouse in your imagination. A faint mix of olive oil, damp stone, and questionable life choices. Because here's the thing about Roman baths. They didn't disappear overnight. They didn't explode. They didn't dramatically collapse into a sinkhole while a toga-clad philosopher shouted about moral decay. They just faded. Slowly, quietly, like steam dissolving into cool evening air. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the Roman Empire itself was having what we might politely call a difficult time. Borders were under pressure. Emperors were changing faster than fashion trends. Money was tight. Infrastructure was aging. And those massive bath complexes? They were infrastructure on steroids. Heating them required wood, lots of wood. Maintaining aqueducts required labor, skilled labor. Keeping marble floors polished and mosaics intact required money, reliable money. And as imperial administration weakened, the baths began to feel less eternal. Some were still operating. In cities like Rome and Constantinople, large imperial baths continued into late antiquity. But smaller provincial bathhouses, they became patchy. Repairs were delayed, rooms closed. Heating systems went cold. The hypocausts, those clever underfloor heating systems, are especially telling. Archaeologists often find them filled with rubble, not destroyed by invaders, just abandoned. Once the furnace stops, the baths stop. Without heat, the tepidarium becomes just a slightly damp room. The caldarium becomes an echo chamber of cold stone. And no one wants to lounge in a freezing caldarium. Now, there's a popular myth that early Christianity banned bathing because it was associated with paganism and moral corruption. Reality is more complicated, because history always is. Christian leaders did criticize certain behaviors, especially mixed bathing, nudity, and the more indulgent social aspects. Public morality became a hotter topic than the baths themselves. But Christians didn't universally oppose cleanliness. In fact, ritual washing had deep religious meaning. What changed wasn't hygiene, it was culture. The baths had been built on the idea of public, communal, imperial leisure. A place where citizens gathered as citizens. When that civic identity fractured, the baths lost part of their purpose. Imagine maintaining a football stadium after the league collapses and half the city leaves. That's roughly what late antiquity felt like. Some bath buildings were repurposed. A frigidarium might become a church. A palestra might become housing. Marble was stripped and reused. Statues were hauled away. And honestly, Roman architecture was too good not to recycle. In many cities, the baths became convenient quarries. Why cut new stone when you can just pry it out of a perfectly good 200-year-old caldarium? Of course you would. Meanwhile, in the eastern half of the empire, bathing traditions evolved rather than vanished. The Byzantine world kept public baths going in modified forms. Later, Islamic civilizations developed hammams, which were deeply influenced by Roman and Byzantine bath culture, so the idea didn't die. It migrated, adapted, changed clothing, metaphorically speaking. Back in Western Europe, though, large-scale public bathing declined significantly in the early medieval period. Urban populations shrank. Aqueducts fell into disrepair. The logistical backbone that supported giant bath complexes simply wasn't there anymore. And so Europe got quieter, colder, less steamy. It's tempting to frame this as decline in dramatic terms. The Dark Ages and the death of cleanliness, that sort of thing. But people still washed. They used rivers, buckets, private tubs. They adapted to smaller-scale living. What disappeared was the spectacle. No more echoing marble halls full of hundreds of bodies. No more imperial bath days sponsored by emperors. No more vast hypocaust systems roaring beneath mosaic floors. The baths had been symbols of a world that believed in itself. When that belief faltered, so did the baths. And here's the quiet irony. For centuries, Romans had treated their bathhouses as proof of superiority. Look at us, they implied. We are civilized. We are clean, we are advanced, and they were. But those very systems were fragile. They required coordination across provinces, stable governance, organized taxation, engineering expertise, supply chains. When complexity collapses, complexity disappears first. A bucket and a sponge survive longer than a 50-room heated palace. By the early medieval period, many of the grand bathhouses stood in ruins. Grass grew between cracked marble slabs. Birds nested in collapsed vaults. Rain pooled where once hot water shimmered. Travelers wrote about them centuries later, awed by their scale. Who built this? They wondered. The answer was Rome. Of course it was. And yet, even in ruins, the baths tell us something. They tell us that ancient life was not purely grim and brutal and joyless. It had routines, luxuries, social rituals, awkward small talk in humid rooms. It had gossip. It had vanity. It had questionable hygiene practices. It had people arguing about politics while sweating through their togas. In other words, it had humanity. Because beneath the marble and steam, that's what the baths really were, a mirror. A place where Romans confronted their own reflections, literally, in polished bronze mirrors, and figuratively, in each other. The rich and poor shared space, even if unequally. The healthy and sick mingled. Philosophers and thieves, senators and slaves, all passed through the same warm air. They may not have understood bacteria. They may have shared sponges in ways that make modern audiences flinch. They may have believed in humors and vapors and bodily balance. But they were trying to relax, trying to heal, trying to belong to something bigger than themselves. And maybe that's why the baths captivate us. Because they're not just about dirt or disease or decadence. They're about a civilization that invested enormous resources into collective comfort. Think about that for a moment. In a world without electricity, without antibiotics, without modern plumbing, they built heated floors. They piped water across mountains. They constructed enormous halls so citizens could soak, sweat, scrape, and socialize together. It's equal parts impressive and absurd. And that's very Roman. So as we let the steam dissipate and the furnaces cool for the last time in this story, imagine the sound fading, the crackle of wood in the hypocaust, the murmur of conversation in the tepidarium, the splash of water in the frigidarium, the scrape of a strigil across skin, then silence. Just wind moving through broken arches. History rarely ends with a bang. It ends with maintenance budgets failing. And yet, even in ruin, the baths endure in memory. Every modern spa, every sauna, every tiled public pool owes something to that ancient obsession with steam and stone. We may not share sponges anymore. We may understand microbes now. We may prefer private bathrooms to 200-person caldariums. But the impulse remains the same. To wash the day away, to sit in warmth. To talk, to exist, briefly, in a space designed for nothing more urgent than comfort. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, think of those long marble corridors glowing in torchlight. Think of rising steam catching golden light. Think of voices blending into a low hum of ancient life. The Roman baths are gone. But the human need for warmth and water? That's eternal. And with that, the steam fades. The doors close. The empire sleeps. Good night.